is Dr. Hannah Burrack. As you guys probably know her, I just want to make sure I introduce. She is the professor and an extension specialist here at NC State in entomology. And today she's going to update us on her pruning work with SWD and give a broad mite update. So Hannah, I will turn it over to you.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and pop up some slides. And I like to keep these, oh, can you guys see my presentation? There we go.
There you go. Okay, now you're
all
in.
Right. Great. I like to keep these conversations pretty informal. So I would encourage you guys to go ahead and unmute if you have a question, or type your questions in the chat box as we go. I've got it up here in the corner. And while I have slides, this is not necessarily what I need to be talking about. I would rather talk with you guys about what you have questions about this morning, not necessarily what I thought you might have questions about. So feel free, please jump in as we go, so I can make sure that I get to any of your questions before we are done with our time here this morning. And I just wanted to give you guys an update on what I'm planning to be out in blackberries doing this year. And that hopefully might help inform some of the questions that you have as well. So in 2020, we had planned to do some broad mite survey work, and I'll be talking about broad mite a little bit more this morning. And for reasons that are obvious to everyone, we did not end up doing that work in 2020. And so that's a project we are carrying over into 2021. And so I may be reaching out to some of your farms to do monthly visits to collect leaf samples and see if there are broad mites present throughout North Carolina, how well they are established, and what populations look like over the course of the season. That work will start in May. And so you might be hearing from me around the end of April, beginning of May, to touch bases and see about coming on out and doing some sampling. And I'm also excited because we're going to be starting a new project on an insect that I haven't had the opportunity to do a lot of work on here in North Carolina, but one that you all deal with on a regular basis in your plantings, whether or not you have damage from it or not. And that's raspberry crown borer. And so I'll talk a little bit about that in the next two slides really quickly. And then we'll also have some projects going out primarily on research stations because of the nature of the materials that we are working with, looking at reducing pesticide applications through some different materials that can be combined with pesticides, as well as refining our pesticide application timing in blackberries. That timing work may end up having an on-farm component, looking at some fruit sampling related to trap captures, but not doing any on-farm interventions this year relative to SWD. So just to highlight a little bit of what we've got going forward with that raspberry crown borer work. Raspberry crown borer, as you guys know, is a kind of perennial concern for our blackberry and raspberry production here in the eastern US. We have to manage for them on a preventative basis, making applications either in the late fall or early spring based on some really nice work that my colleague Don Johnson, who's recently retired from the University of Arkansas, did. And we do this because if we leave them unchecked, their damage will eventually render plants unproductive and kill them. And we know that this happens because when we go out to blackberry or raspberry plantings in North Carolina that have not been managing for raspberry crown borer, and a lot of these are some of our organic growers or people who are trying to produce organically, we see plants going down after 5 to 6 years of being in the ground without raspberry crown borer management. And so that's kind of the risk we run when we don't make that late fall or early spring pesticide application. The larvae live for 1 to 2 years. That's going to depend on your environmental conditions, how cool you are. And they also make plants more susceptible to cold damage. And so before I leave this point, I want to echo what John Clark said earlier at the very beginning of this conversation, which is we are running the risk for some cold damage this year in some of our parts of the state with respect to low temperatures. And cold damage has a very long tail in perennial crops. So injury due to something like raspberry crown borer can predispose plants to be more susceptible to cold damage. So if you've had some really cool dips this winter and you haven't had a more tight raspberry crown borer management program, you may see some plants going down that you hadn't expected necessarily to be injured. And that's a good time to dig those plants up, look at the crowns, and see what's going on with them, and confirm whether or not they were undamaged or whether they potentially had raspberry crown borer present. And similarly, plants that become stressed due to cold injury can have all sorts of long lingering manifestations. So I remember seeing cane boring insects being more intense in plants that have cold damage or cold stress. You can also see other, crongal issues, non-insect related issues associated with cold injury. And so keep that in mind as you start to walk around your fields this summer. You might see things that have kind of that long-term impact associated with a short-term cold event. All right, so management for raspberry crown borer has been these preventative late fall or early spring applications, but we are really interested in trying to refine that. And by refine that, we're interested in trying to determine if these pheromone lures that have recently been marketed for raspberry crown borer are effective in our environments. There's some work that was done about 7 years ago, published, but hasn't really made it out into the world of production, that the pheromone was identified for raspberry crown borer, but we don't know anything about how it behaves in the field here in the eastern US. The reason why this is important is because these clearwing moths here shown down here on the right often have very similar pheromones to each other. And so you can attract different species to the pheromone that might have been optimized for a given pest. And that makes interpreting those trap captures a little bit challenging unless you can easily distinguish between the moths that you're capturing. We also don't have a whole lot of good information on when the moths are out about flying and active. All the work that has been done on raspberry crown borer has really focused on the immature stages, the eggs, the larvae, the things that we can dig up plants and find on the plant, not on the adults that are flying around. And so if we can better understand the seasonal biology of these adults and when they are becoming active and moving into our plantings, that opens up avenues of management that we haven't previously had. And so if we have the ability to time different management tactics to egg laying periods, that may improve our control and lessen our reliance on these preventative applications. The last component that I think is potentially really interesting is when we go out and trap for these clearwing moths in other crops where they are pests, like grapes, for example, where grape root borer is a significant concern. We don't always find them, which means that their populations are not necessarily a given on a specific farm. And so if we can determine through a good monitoring program that you don't have raspberry crown borer present, then that could also reduce your need to make some of those preventative applications unless they are actually there. And so again, this is going to be an on-farm monitoring effort. Again, I will be reaching out to some folks to see if we can implement some trapping locations at farms throughout the state to really get this information in hand. All right, so the next topic I want to touch on is broad mites, and this has been a concern in the last roughly 3 years here in North Carolina, as well as in Arkansas, South Carolina, and some other states. And they are teeny tiny. This is a really excellent photo that Karen took, actually, which allows you to see both the hairs on a blackberry leaf, just for scale, and then also some broad mite adults here and a broad mite egg. And that broad mite egg is really the key diagnostic stage. The adults are pretty distinctive as well, but if you see those eggs, that you've got broad mites present, because nothing else on the undersides of your leaves are going to look like this. You're going to want to look at your leaves at about 10x to 20x magnification to be able to observe those eggs. And so that's the degree of magnification you're going to need to make a positive diagnosis. And This was work that was done in 2020 by my colleague, Aaron Cato, who is at University of Arkansas. He was able to get out and do some surveying this year for broad mite populations. And so he looked at a range of different locations. And what he observed was this early season population for them, which occurred in June, and for us might be bumped a little bit earlier, and a late season population, which was much larger. And that's what he's been really interested in focusing on from a management standpoint, because a lot of these late season populations for them have been developing post-harvest, and understanding the impacts of these late season populations on the next year's production has been an open question. All right. So, and this is the damage that we're talking about due to broad mite. Upward cupping of the leaves can look a little bit like herbicide damage as well. So you want to rule that out, but just take those leaves, pop them under a microscope or under a hand lens, and look to observe those eggs. If you have a hard time observing that, feel free to send samples into the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic, or get in touch with your county agent who can get those in there, and we can get you a confirmed diagnosis pretty quickly on that as well. And this is kind of the timeline that we've experienced issues with broad mite throughout the eastern US. We had no real concern about them in caneberries until 2007. But in September 2007, my colleagues in Arkansas, Don Johnson and others, observed significant broad mite populations in a research plot that they were working at under tunnels. And so the initial thought was, when they saw these first populations, is maybe this is a tunnel problem. Maybe this is something that we're dealing with in that type of environment. We started seeing a handful of reports come in from North Carolina in 2009 that popped up in the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic, and then nothing else. I started getting a couple emails in 2012 from my colleagues in Pennsylvania showing some similar damage, but I wasn't hearing anything about them in North Carolina, nor were they really doing a whole lot or hearing a lot in Arkansas. However, the following year in 2013, they started confirming damage throughout commercial production in Arkansas, which was not necessarily under high tunnels. And so that's when the concern began to increase outside of that controlled environment production area. And then in 2014, there were additional reports throughout North Carolina, as well as in other states. But then again, we had a period of quiet. So from 2014 to 2019, I didn't hear much about them in North Carolina or other places. And then in 2019, we started seeing these populations pop up again. And so this is why we don't have a really good handle on the extent of the problem associated with broad mites, and why we are trying to increase the amount of information that we have about them. And this is just a list of materials that were tested by Don Johnson in Arkansas, that initial population, looking for efficacy of any of the materials that we had available. And so the materials that are highlighted here in bold 7 days after the first treatment was applied are the ones that significantly reduced populations relative to the untreated control. Zeal here shouldn't be bold. I apologize for that. But you have, so these Agromec, Apta, and Magister significantly reduced infestation, and Pete and Zeal are also registered. And so that's one of the reasons that they're highlighted. But I do want to point out, in some cases, the application followed the labeled rate for those products. So for Agromec, that followed the label rate, but the label also recommends the addition of a non-ionic surfactant to that product. But for Magister, for example, the application that Don tested was below the labeled rate. So we'd expect perhaps some additional reductions associated with going up to that labeled rate range. And then the rate that Don tested for Zeal was within the labeled rate range, and again, didn't get the greatest response in terms of reduction relative to that range. And so that's perhaps not a product that we would be terribly aggressive with. And then finally, Apta is labeled in caneberries now and was at the labeled application rate. I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead just to highlight, in the interest of time, the pruning work that Karen mentioned. And this just really feeds into, and I'm not going to go ahead and do the presentation mode just because I want to be able to hop around these slides real quickly. And this just ties into what I want to remind you guys are your 3 essential strategies for managing spotted wing and caneberries. We know that caneberries are at high risk for spotted wing damage. And so it's important for us to use insecticides at the right time, but insecticides in many cases will not get you all the way to sufficient spotted wing control. And so it's also really important for you to optimize your cultural controls and continue your management program post-harvest. And so when we think about cultural controls, we think about a suite of practices that have the potential to provide additional reduction in spotted wing populations. These can include things like exclusion netting, managing irrigation. Those two are not as important for us here in the Southeast. You can get reductions associated with netting, and we can talk about that more if you have questions. But what I'm going to focus on is pruning intensity, harvest frequency, and refrigeration. Those are the things that we get our kind of best bang for our buck in terms of control. So this is work that was coordinated across the United States, both in blueberries and blackberries, looking at a high rate of pruning, a moderate rate of pruning, and a low rate of pruning. So high canopy density, moderate canopy density, and low canopy density. And this is work that we did in blackberries down here in North Carolina. And we collected a lot of information in these plots. We collected information about yield. We collected information about the environment created within that canopy when they had that high rate of canopy of pruning. And so just again to highlight, the low canopy density is our most aggressive pruning rate, and our moderate canopy density was our typical pruning rate for blackberries. So this is what most folks would be doing. And what we saw is that in our blackberries, we were able to reduce the amount of infestation per fruit, or sorry, per gram of fruit of spotted wing by increasing the degree of pruning that we had in place. And so this low density canopy resulted in the lowest rate of infestation, but no difference in marketable yield. And so that's a really important thing to take home from this, is that we didn't reduce the amount of yield we were taking off these plants. We had a difference in total yield, but that was not all marketable fruit, probably due to the fact that we had some reduction in infestation there. So that's one component. Another important component to keep in mind is harvest frequency. This is data from raspberries, but the same information would apply to blackberries. If you harvest every day or every 2 days, you have the potential to significantly reduce the amount of eggs, larvae, and large larvae that are present in your fruit. And so that, again, effectively decreases the risk associated with infestation. And that's important because that decreases the amount of exposure time that you have to egg laying flies for every ripe berry that's out there. And then finally, I just want to point out the post-harvest cold storage component. So when you get your fruit as cold as possible, and in this case, I'm showing you all the way down to 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit for as long as possible post-harvest, that's also going to reduce the amount of potential survival that you have for eggs, larvae within the fruit. And I'm just going to pop through. This one I will pop open just because it has some animation in it. All right, and so this is looking at individual life stages: newly laid eggs, 1 day old eggs, small larvae, medium larvae, and large larvae. And you can see at 0 degrees Fahrenheit, you see that significant and high level of reduction associated with survival of all of those different life stages. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and then hopefully have a minute or two here left for questions.
Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and stop, probably stop the recording. And if folks just want to